Hello, I'm Jeremy, the Zoo Nerd, coming to you live from my backyard in beautiful Los Angeles, California. Today it's a little cooler, cloudy, and a bit of a change here in LA, and it's welcome. How's everybody out there doing? I hope you're well. I hope you're happy. I hope you're healthy. I hope you're having some fun. Today we're going to talk about a species that is iconic and has been an important species for humans for thousands of years. Today we're going to talk about bighorn sheep. Bighorn sheep are an icon of the American West. They are best known for their battering head clashes of the males leading into their breeding season, and they're a long time honored and respected by people who have lived in the American West. We've named a football team after them with the Los Angeles Rams. There's a car and truck company called the Dodge Ram that takes their inspiration from the males of this species. But before any of that happened, they were one of the most frequently observed animals in Native American petroglyphs. So they have been an important and iconic species for thousands of years. So their headbutting of the males happens before the breeding season. Sorry, there's a helicopter. See if it gets a little quieter. So male bighorn sheep do this crazy thing prior to the breeding season. They have a very passionate battle of hitting their heads together and smashing into each other to see who's the boss, who's the biggest, boldest male, and the winner of those battles is who gets to breed with the females in the area. Now those battles can sometimes last hours at a time, even days on end, and sometimes result in some pretty serious injury and possibly even death between the males. Those big horns that their species are named after come off at the top of the skull and kind of curl back and around and even point out front of their face. A big mature male can have horns that make almost a full loop. And those are very impressive horns. They grow throughout their life. They stay on their head their entire life, unlike the deer species who lose their antlers. Bighorn sheep retain their horns throughout their lifetime. Those can sometimes weigh between 30 and 40 pounds by the end of a bighorn sheep's life, so they are huge horns. Underneath those horns, their skull actually has two layers of bones. So there's a kind of an outer layer of the skull and then a bunch of spongy cellulose material, and then another layer of bone before the brain case. And that helps to kind of shock absorb any of that damage from doing the headbutting. And some researchers are actually looking at the structure of that to better improve football helmets. So it's something that they've kind of taken a lot of inspiration from. Bighorn sheep, as far as their size go, are kind of medium to large sized animals. The biggest of the males weigh in typically just short of 300 pounds, and that's going to be the males that live further north in their range, with the females being about a third to a half the size. So the females typically are between 100 and 150 pounds. The males are about 42 inches tall at the shoulder, so that's about 3.5 feet. Females right around 3 feet high at the shoulder. Now bighorn sheep, they live throughout a very large range. They range all the way up into Canada, down through the Rocky Mountains and some of the coastal range mountains, all the way through the mountainous states and into the desert Southwest and a bit into Mexico. And across that range, it's largely accepted that there are 3 subspecies of bighorn sheep, although of course with science all things are kind of still up for debate, and the genetics of bighorn sheep is one of those things that is contested. So some say there's as many as 7 subspecies, some say there's really not even 3. So we're gonna go with 3 today. It's a nice middle ground. Those would be the Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep. Those are the ones that live furthest north up in Canada and throughout the high elevations of the central Rocky Mountains, Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, Utah, and Colorado. And then the next subspecies is sometimes called the Californian or Sierra Nevada subspecies. Those are the bighorn sheep that live in the Sierra Nevadas, the high mountains of California, into Nevada, a little bit into Utah. And then there are the desert bighorn sheep, which live across Southern California, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, a bit in Colorado, a bit in Texas, and into the country of Mexico. The desert subspecies definitely has differences from the far northern ranging, the ones up in Canada and Montana, Washington, and Idaho. Those guys up north have a thicker coat, they have smaller ears, they have kind of a tighter, stockier body, whereas the desert subspecies is a little bit more lanky. The desert subspecies also has thinner horns, but they can grow longer in both the males and the females. The females have horns too, they just don't do the head butting, but they will use their horns to protect themselves from potential predators, and they'll also sometimes use their horns to help dig for food, especially if there's snow with the northern populations. Now, with all of these subspecies and the different areas that they lived in, there's actually a subspecies of the bighorn sheep that is extinct. They used to live in the Dakotas, Montana, Nebraska, and Wyoming. And they were officially declared extinct in 1925. So almost 100 years ago, they disappeared. And with them being the furthest eastern ranging bighorns, the story of bighorn sheep really, and the human impact on the population of bighorn sheep really shows itself there with the species that was in the Dakotas and Wyoming and Nebraska and Montana. As people moved west, bighorn sheep quickly started to lose their ground. It was estimated that in the 1800s, around 1800, that there were between 1.5 and 2 million individual bighorn sheep throughout that range from Canada down to Mexico. And as people moved further west, they started to impact the areas of bighorn sheep. And when people moved west, they brought with them domestic livestock, which was the biggest problem and biggest threat to the sheep populations during those times. Particularly that domestic sheep can carry some diseases that bighorn sheep can easily catch and can spread through them pretty abruptly and cause death. One of those is a type of pneumonia that domestic sheep can carry that bighorn sheep don't normally get, and it's usually fatal with the bighorn sheep. And between that and hunting and just general habitat disruption, those are the reasons that that subspecies went extinct up in the Dakotas. Some populations of bighorn sheep are still threatened today. Particularly the species that lives down in Baja, Mexico is very limited. Some of the desert bighorn sheep populations are very limited. And for a long time, the population of bighorn sheep in the Sierra Nevada mountains was very threatened. But there is good news. So they were at about 1.5 million to 2 million in 1800. By the 1950s, total population was down to 8,000. But then a lot of conservation work began. A lot of people put some very strict laws in place. They eliminated hunting of bighorn sheep during that time and really started to focus on some conservation work and protection of their habitat. Today it's estimated that there's about 70,000 bighorn sheep out there across that big range of land. And that's some really good news, but like I said, some populations are still locally threatened. Overall, it's important to note that conservation works, and a lot of these conservation measures with bighorn sheep existed prior to things like the Endangered Species Act that was not signed into place until 1970s. By then, bighorn sheep were already making a comeback. They were kind of a front runner of a lot of those conservation laws. And that's a good thing because it helped Americans understand that there can be reversal of laws that can help protect species. So some of the big threats that bighorn sheep have faced and continue to face, the biggest of which is habitat loss. They don't deal very well with people. They get annoyed by people quite easily. And if there's something like a road, it causes them a lot of stress, and then they're more susceptible to disease and other problems. Also, as people move into different habitats, sometimes they start to cut down the trees and the other bushes in the area, and that degrades the habitat. Particularly things like preparing the land for wildfires has caused problem, and it eliminates a lot of the food that bighorn sheep eat. They will eat grass, but they will also eat any of the branches of low-lying bushes and trees. And sometimes those bushes and trees are clear-cut or removed for the sake of protecting the natural environment from wildfires. Also, fragmentation has been a big problem as people build roads, go in and build dams, dam rivers that the bighorn sheep used to easily cross. Now there's a big lake there, they can't get across the lake. So that splits the population up into isolated pockets. And that has caused trouble throughout a lot of the range, specifically of the desert bighorn sheep, with some of the big reservoirs and lakes throughout the desert Southwest. I already mentioned briefly the competition and the disease threat brought by domestic livestock. Those can be big problems for bighorn sheep and still are today. I just read an article earlier today about bighorn sheep that were dying off near Palm Springs, in the mountains around Palm Springs, and they feel that they had come into contact with domestic sheep up in the mountains there, and that caused a big die-off of the local population there. Similarly, in the area around Yellowstone National Park, there was a disease spread also by either wild cattle or wild sheep, or sorry, domestic cows or sheep that got into the bighorn sheep population and caused a big die-off for them a few years back. There is also still threats for poaching from their horns. They're a very beautiful animal. A lot of people think that that would make a nice decoration or trophy on their wall. The big problem with that is they're hunting the animals with the biggest horns. Those are usually the big breeding males, and so that disrupts a lot of problems in the local populations with passing on some very strong genetics to the next generation. And the hunt usually happens prior to breeding season and interrupts a lot of the potential there. With the breeding season, so the bighorn sheep, the males will fight and kind of smash against each other's heads. That's at a speed of about 30 miles an hour of them running, charging each other, smashing heads and horns together. And that can be heard for up to a mile away. I've never heard the sound specifically other than in videos, but I've never heard it in my life. But it is something I hope to be able to witness and see because it looks pretty impressive. I'm now getting a little bit of rain here, so I'll continue on. We'll see how it goes. After the breeding, the female bighorn sheep is pregnant, or her gestation period is between 5 and 6 months, with lambs being born in the springtime. Now, a bighorn sheep lamb is an adorable little baby, and they are very quick to kind of grow into the iconic things that bighorns can do, which is run up and down the mountainside. Within 2 or 3 days, they can easily maneuver up and down cliffs, and within a week, they can keep up with the rest of the herd very easily. So even though they're just wee little babies, just learning how to walk and figuring out life, they are pretty quick to pick up the ability for them to move up and down very rocky terrain that they live in. They also have some really excellent senses. They have really good sense of vision. It's estimated that they can watch the footing of other bighorns up to a mile away as they walk up and down a mountainside. That helps them to kind of learn that if they're going that same direction, which way up the mountain they could go to get to the top. They migrate a lot seasonally between higher and lower elevations, typically coming down in elevation into some like mountain valleys without people in them during the winter time, and then going up as high as 13,000 feet in elevation during the summer months. During those times, they'll eat the different vegetation that's kind of greenest around during that time. So the food that they eat varies quite a bit throughout the seasons as they move up and down the hillsides. Out there in the wild, they do have to watch out for a number of predators depending on where they live. Their most common predator, who also shares the majority of their range with them, would be mountain lions, also known as cougars or pumas. These good-sized cats in the Americas are a very formidable predator for bighorn sheep, although the cats cannot go up and down the steep hillsides as easily as the bighorn sheep can. And so they can typically get away from a predator by going to the steep cliffs, and that's how they usually are able to avoid them. Other predators would include things like wolves or coyotes, if those are present in their range. Sometimes some smaller cats like lynx or bobcat. And especially for the little ones, they need to watch out for golden eagles. It has been observed that eagles will harass a bighorn sheep herd and try to make the little ones stumble or fall off a cliff, and then they'll, as the babies fall down the cliff, they'll go down and eat what is still around afterwards. So eagles are a formidable predator for the younger ones. They are often confused with a couple of different relatives throughout North America. So in North America, we have two wild sheep species, the bighorn sheep and the other ones that live further north called Dall sheep. They look very similar body shape and have the curled horns, but the Dall sheep that live in Alaska are completely white, whereas the bighorn sheep kind of have a gray, tan, or brown colored coat, depending on where they live. Now, to make that even more tricky, there's a subspecies of Dall sheep called the stone sheep. They live in Canada, and they are kind of a darker color, like a dark charcoaly gray color, and they look almost identical to a bighorn sheep, but their horns are thinner throughout. I have seen both Dall sheep and stone sheep out in the wild during some of my travels in Canada and Alaska, and they are beautiful animals as well. They are also sometimes mistaken for a more distant relative called the mountain goat. Rocky mountain goat is also sometimes what those are called. They are much more shaggy of a body type. They typically have a more rugged looking face with sharp spiky horns that are shorter horns. Those guys are even better at climbing cliffs and are quite common throughout the Pacific Northwest, Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, and a bit into Idaho, Montana, and a little bit in Utah and Colorado. But if they're pure white and they're in the lower 48, those are mountain goats. If they're in Alaska, it could be mountain goats or Dall sheep. If they're pure white, though, they are not a bighorn sheep. So let me share some of my experiences with bighorn sheep. I've had the great opportunity of observing them multiple times in the wild, as well as in a zoo setting where I worked with them as their zookeeper. My first experience seeing bighorn sheep in the wild was when I was just a little kid. I was probably 6 or 7 years old, and my family had gone on vacation to Yellowstone National Park, and we were hiking a very large mountain there called Mount Washburn. And I was the youngest one in our group that was hiking. My younger brother was on the trip, but he didn't go on the hike. He stayed behind with my grandma. So I was the smallest person there. And we saw some bighorn sheep kind of far off in the distance when we were walking up the trail, up the mountain. And then on our way back down, we came down a different side of the trail. And as we came down that trail, we actually crossed a path where the bighorn sheep herd was crossing the path at the same time. So we had bighorn sheep kind of on both sides of the trail, and some crossed right in front of us, and as we walked a little bit more, some crossed right behind us, and they got pretty close to us, and I was very scared. I remember being very, very scared. This was a female group. That's typically how they live during the summertime. Females with the babies. Males usually hang off together separately, and then they'll come together during breeding season, and then they'll split off again into a female-dominated group and a male-dominated group. But this was a female group. There was probably about 25 of them. They were led by a very older looking female who was the biggest of them. She only had one horn, the other one was broken and gone. And I thought she looked very mean and scary. And I was pretty terrified that we were surrounded by them, and I thought they were gonna charge me because I had watched a video of the males charging, and I thought that's what they did at all times. They didn't do anything to us. They were very cautious and gave us some space, we gave them some space, and we went on our way. I have since hiked that mountain as an adult, and I also came across bighorn sheep on that same trail system. Although it was a big group of males, and they were kind of just sitting in a meadow up near the top of the mountain, and we just kind of cut wide and went around them. They just kind of sat there chewing their cud or chewing their food that they had eaten previously. That's something that all sheep, cows, goats do. A lot of animals like that are called ruminants. They have 4 stomachs, so they eat food, then they regurgitate it, chew it again, swallow it again, it goes to the next stomach, and kind of this complex up and down system that helps them to gain the most nutrients from the sometimes not very nutritious food that they eat. But I've also seen bighorn sheep throughout a big portion of their range. I've seen them up in the Canadian Rockies. I've seen them in the desert near Hoover Dam, just outside Las Vegas, and through a little canyon area into Utah called the Virgin River Gorge. I've also seen them on the shore of Lake Powell in Utah 2 summers ago. They came down to the water's edge and were drinking as we went by in our boat. And it's always exciting time to see them out in the wild because it's just amazing how well they can navigate their habitat and move across rocks that you and I certainly couldn't move across in a very easy way. I've also worked with them in a zoo setting. So at the Phoenix Zoo, we had one of the largest captive bighorn sheep populations of any zoo in the United States. The Phoenix Zoo sits on a big piece of land with some very large sandstone buttes or small mountains, big rocks that are kind of at the back of the zoo. And for the Phoenix Zoo, they just put a big fence around both those big rocky areas, and that's the bighorn sheep exhibit. The one yard is several acres in size, I think 2 or 3, and the other one is just a bit smaller with 1 or 2 acres in it. But we had at one time 20 individual bighorn sheep in those 2 different yards. It was always really great to see them, particularly on a sunrise or a sunset. They'd be way up high on the rocks and silhouetted against the sky. It was incredible to see them move. When babies were born at the bighorn sheep and the vets were trying to get a wellness exam on the baby, they had to do that within the first day of the baby being spotted, or else the baby would be too quick to climb up to the top of the rocks. And if it went up there, it became too dangerous for the people to try to go get it to do the vet exam on it. So they had to be very quick about that. When I moved to Los Angeles and became a zookeeper at the LA Zoo, I was able to be trained on the section that worked with the bighorn sheep. And I worked with them many days during my employment there. And it was really great to work with them. They're very smart species that I don't think they get credit for their smarts as much as they do. But they had a very good system as to coming inside their concrete mountain while we went out and cleaned, and then they would come back out. But they were very observant of figuring out who was their person that day. And when that person came by with food or would talk with them, they would listen. And they would move very easily up and down their concrete mountain. During my time at LA Zoo, we had multiple lambs born, and it was always really cute to see the new baby bighorn sheep and their ability to move up and down their fake mountain that they lived on in the zoo. I'll be posting some video and photos of bighorn sheep and other information about them up on the Facebook profile later today. So make sure you check that out as well. I hope you enjoy what I've shared with you today about bighorn sheep, and I will be joining you again tomorrow to talk about another critter on Critter Chat. As always, feel free to like, follow, share, and subscribe with any of the information I post on Zoo Nerd across Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Share that with family and friends and others who may be interested. I'll see you tomorrow. Take care. Be safe. Bye.